You don't need to relate. Honestly, you don't have to relate. This is the weirdest opinion I've ever done, but yes, a lot of protagonists in fantasy nowadays, the obsession here is to have a likable protagonist. Why must we always have a likable protagonist? We don't need the protagonist to be likable or relatable in any way. Of course, I don't really blame authors entirely. I think this is also on the readers, because a lot of people, when they buy books, they want to relate to the protagonist. They want to relate to the experiences of the protagonist. But if you are someone who has been raised in a developed country, you haven't had enough experiences to relate to most people. So why, in other words, to relate is to have had the experience, and to understand is to actually look at someone else who you don't relate with. In other words, you have not experienced what they have experienced, but instead to understand why they are struggling with what they are struggling, number one. And number two, to understand their motivation. Readers will actively lower the star rating they give to a book from 4 to 3 stars, or maybe 3 stars to 2 stars, because they don't relate with the character. I honestly want to stand against this because it baffles me. I love it when authors take the risk of having unlikable protagonists who are not necessarily motivated by things that can be understood by a mainstream reader base, but instead they are motivated by specific things that most people will not find relatable. However, if the author does a good job, they can understand this protagonist. This is one of the reasons why I love Grimdark fantasy, because Grimdark is not scared to have unlikable protagonists, number one. But number two, a lot of the time what will end up happening is that they have understandable protagonists. This is my opinion. This is what I believe wholeheartedly. In other words, and I hope you can understand where I'm coming from, I don't care to relate to your protagonist. Let's say you are a writer. I don't honestly care to relate to your protagonist. What I want to do is to understand your protagonist. Do you know why? Because I have not lived every experience. Therefore, I cannot relate to every protagonist. And I don't care to relate to your protagonist. I care to understand your protagonist, because to me, your protagonist should not be someone I can relate to. They should be someone I must put effort into so that I can understand them. And you, as the writer, as the author, you must put effort to make your character and your protagonist understandable. This is a back and forth relationship. Readers should not punish authors with bad star reviews because they don't relate to the protagonist. This is an issue I ran into with Prince of Thorns, Jorg from The Broken Empire, written by Mark Lawrence. And the issue I seem to have had here is I saw a lot of people that were saying, I didn't find the protagonist, Jorg, relatable. Jorg has had his mother killed when he was 9. He has had his younger brother, William, killed when he was 9. And his father, he refused to avenge the death of his mother and, younger brother, William. We understand Jorg. At least I'm assuming, but I generally understood Jorg. I did not care to relate from the beginning, and I understood Jorg. You see, it's very simple, but simple does not mean bad, because guess what? Every step along the way, you understand Jorg. You don't relate to Jorg. There's no need to relate to him. You shouldn't care to relate to someone who is so swallowed by the rage and fury, because again, I never had my mother assassinated by my uncle. I never had my, my younger brothers killed by my uncle, an assassin sent by my uncle. And if that happened, I don't think my father would refuse to seek justice with me, and we would both go on this particular journey together. But generally speaking, Jorg has something happen to him that I have never experienced in my life, and therefore I don't really care to relate to him. I care to understand Jorg, and I invite people to do this more often. It is very scary and very weird because authors are put in this hole and in this spot where they have to always make sure that there is something relatable about their protagonist. Otherwise, the readers might get disconnected. And I think this is mostly a Western perspective, because in East Africa, heroes are 99% of the time like Jorg. They are people who have been broken, and they are people who are monsters, and they do terrible things only to learn, only to become better. right? And the goal and the objective is to always have them be better. So I'm not particularly certain if this is a cultural theme, mostly with Americans and Canadians and people from Europe. But the way I see it is Jorg is a perfect protagonist, and he's not bad because he's evil. He is a great protagonist because you don't necessarily have to relate to him, you have to understand him. And if you don't really need to understand a protagonist, is that a protagonist? Like, that's basically you. If you never have to understand, if you never are forced to understand someone else, that person might as well be a clone of you or the least common denominator in society. And that is boring. That's the first issue with having to relate to every protagonist. Number two, the reason why books are oftentimes good and the reason why books make you smarter is because, guess what? Books give you the experience. They put you in the shoes of people like Jorg, and who are struggling with grief, and they have lost a lot, and they are basically blinded by their flaws, and they need a solution. Books give you this, and this is why books make you smarter. If you always seek a book where you can relate to the protagonist, or the protagonist is a shell, an empty vessel for the audience, what ends up happening is that books never make you smarter. You just keep reading more books, and every book is technically the same, because at the heart of it, at the core of it, what is structuring the book is the protagonist, and the protagonist is mostly the same. Therefore, what you learn from books is mostly the same. And you defeat the purpose of learning from books. Books, in other words, will not make you smarter if you are picking up stories where the protagonists are always relatable. And in that particular case, the second problem with relatable protagonists is that if you relate to all of your protagonists, and if you actively seek books where you relate to your protagonists, you lose the benefit of books making you smarter, because there's never a new experience. And the final problem, I think, is actually rooted with authors and readers and the relationship between them. Because if readers are always looking for books where the protagonists are relatable, well, and what ends up happening is that authors make more of this stuff. And the genres, the topics that are being covered, the themes that are being explored in your favorite genre, they don't advance much. And what ends up happening is the genre stagnates. Eventually, you end up having with an entire generation of people who are pissed off at the chosen one trope. Like this happened with fantasy. For so long, readers were looking for the chosen one trope. Readers bought books with chosen one protagonists who were empty vessels. And what ended up happening is that, in the fantasy genre, the writers and the authors kept making more of that shit. And eventually there was a new generation, my generation, and the generation before me, millennials. And ultimately, these two generations clowned on the chosen one. They clowned on the chosen one super hard, basically dunked on that particular trope, because we wanted more from fantasy. We were bored of this chosen one trope. This is why modern fantasy doesn't have a lot of chosen ones. It is rare to find a chosen one the way it used to be, which is an empty vessel for you to hop on and to be an awesome, dude with a flaming sword and dragons and all the beautiful women want you, right? Basically, the definition of a terrible, boring story. And this will happen if readers seek relatable protagonists. But if readers seek protagonists where they have to understand instead of relate, the genre will always be going in new and unpredictable ways. That will make you sure that every book you buy from your favorite genre is never boring, because every time you have to put in the effort to understand the characters, it's never the same. And I want to encourage you to not necessarily seek books where the protagonists are relatable. I want to really encourage you to seek books where the protagonists have to be understood, and that you have to put in effort to understand these characters, because they are flawed people that have nuances that you must understand. I will leave you with that. I do daily uploads. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was not too preachy or too crazy, or like it looked like I was screaming most of the time. I am really passionate about this. That's why I'm screaming a lot. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Have a nice day.